By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War was no longer simply a battlefield conflict fought in jungles and rice paddies. It had become something far deeper and more destructive, a war that reshaped global politics, shattered trust in governments, and left scars on millions of lives across continents. Although American troops would soon begin withdrawing from Vietnam, the consequences of the war were only just beginning. The fallout spread across Southeast Asia, into American society, and into the psychological and political landscapes of the Cold War itself. The world watched as a superpower struggled to accept the limits of its military might, while Vietnam, devastated by decades of war, faced the monumental challenge of rebuilding a shattered nation. The conflict had lasted far longer than most Americans or Vietnamese had ever imagined. It had drawn in millions of soldiers, devastated villages, and turned entire regions into wastelands of bomb craters and chemical contamination. For the Vietnamese people, victory would not bring peace overnight. For the United States, withdrawal would not erase the trauma or political divisions created by the war. Instead, both nations would enter a long and painful period of recovery that would define their futures for generations. As 1973 approached, the United States was desperate to end its direct involvement. American public opinion had shifted dramatically. The war was increasingly seen as unwinnable, morally troubling, and financially draining. Anti-war protests had erupted across college campuses and major cities, and returning veterans often faced indifference or hostility rather than celebration. At the same time, North Vietnam remained determined to achieve complete reunification under communist rule. The stage was set for one of the most complex endings to any modern war, a conclusion that would leave no true winners, only survivors. In January 1973, after years of negotiations, secret meetings, and diplomatic maneuvering, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement was presented as a pathway to peace, but beneath the optimistic language lay deep tensions and unresolved conflicts. The accords called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the release of prisoners of war, and negotiations between North and South Vietnam regarding political reconciliation. For American leaders, the agreement offered an exit strategy. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger framed the accords as peace with honor, arguing that the United States had fulfilled its commitments and preserved South Vietnam's independence. However, critics quickly pointed out that North Vietnamese forces remained inside South Vietnam, effectively ensuring that the conflict would continue once American troops left. For soldiers on the ground, the ceasefire brought mixed emotions. Many American troops felt relief that their long deployments were ending, yet others feared that their sacrifices had been in vain. South Vietnamese soldiers, meanwhile, felt abandoned. Without large-scale American air support and logistical backing, they would be forced to face the North Vietnamese army largely on their own. The release of American prisoners of war became one of the most emotional aspects of the agreement. Images of returning POWs stepping off military aircraft captured the attention of the American public. Families who had waited years for news of their loved ones finally experienced moments of reunion and closure. However, behind the scenes, thousands of Vietnamese prisoners, on both sides, remained detained or unaccounted for, a stark reminder that the human cost of the war extended far beyond American losses. Despite international celebration of the accords, many observers recognized their fragile nature. The agreement did not resolve the fundamental political struggle between North and South Vietnam. Instead, it created a temporary pause, allowing both sides to regroup and prepare for the next phase of conflict. After American combat forces withdrew, South Vietnam faced enormous challenges. The government in Saigon struggled with corruption, declining morale, and economic instability. Inflation soared, and supplies once provided by American support became scarce. Meanwhile, North Vietnam quietly rebuilt its military strength, moving troops and equipment along the Ho Chi Minh Trail with increasing confidence. By 1975, the fragile ceasefire had effectively collapsed. North Vietnamese forces launched a massive offensive, targeting key cities and military positions across South Vietnam. The speed of the offensive shocked both South Vietnamese leaders and American observers. Entire divisions of South Vietnamese troops collapsed under pressure, often retreating in disorganized chaos. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 marked one of the most dramatic moments in modern history. As North Vietnamese tanks rolled toward the city, panic spread among civilians and officials desperate to escape. The United States launched Operation Frequent Wind, a massive evacuation effort using helicopters to rescue American personnel and selected South Vietnamese allies. Television broadcasts showed helicopters landing on rooftops as crowds scrambled for evacuation. These images became lasting symbols of the war's chaotic conclusion. Many South Vietnamese citizens who had supported or worked with the United States were left behind, fearing retribution from the incoming communist government. When North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon, the city was quickly renamed Ho Chi Minh City, symbolizing the reunification of Vietnam under communist leadership. For North Vietnam, it was a triumphant victory after decades of struggle against foreign powers. For South Vietnam, it marked the end of its independence and the beginning of a new and uncertain future. Following the fall of Saigon, Vietnam faced the enormous task of rebuilding a country devastated by decades of warfare. Infrastructure had been destroyed, agricultural land contaminated, and millions of civilians displaced. Entire regions were littered with unexploded bombs and landmines, posing deadly risks long after the fighting ended. The Vietnamese government launched ambitious programs to reunify the country politically, economically, and socially. However, these efforts often came with harsh consequences. Many former South Vietnamese officials, military officers, and suspected opponents of the new government were sent to re-education camps. These camps aimed to reshape political beliefs through forced labor and ideological training, but conditions were frequently harsh, and thousands of detainees suffered or died. Economic reconstruction proved equally challenging. Vietnam adopted centralized socialist policies that struggled to revive agricultural and industrial production. Food shortages and poverty became widespread during the late 1970s. Additionally, international isolation and sanctions limited Vietnam's ability to access foreign aid and trade opportunities. Despite these difficulties, the Vietnamese people demonstrated remarkable resilience. Communities rebuilt villages, repaired infrastructure, and slowly restored farmland. The recovery process would take decades, but it reflected the determination of a nation that had endured extraordinary hardship. One of the most tragic consequences of Vietnam's reunification was the mass exodus of refugees known as the Boat People. Fearing political persecution, economic hardship, or forced relocation, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese citizens fled the country by sea. Many crowded into fragile fishing boats, risking storms, starvation, and attacks from pirates. The journey was often deadly. Thousands of refugees drowned or disappeared at sea. Those who survived faced uncertain futures in refugee camps across Southeast Asia. The global community eventually responded with resettlement programs, allowing many Vietnamese refugees to build new lives in countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. The refugee crisis highlighted the human cost of the war's aftermath. Families were separated, cultures displaced, and generations forced to rebuild identities in foreign lands. Even decades later, the experiences of the Boat People remain a powerful reminder of the war's lingering impact. The war's psychological toll on veterans. While Vietnam struggled to rebuild physically, the United States faced a different kind of recovery. American veterans returned home carrying invisible wounds that would challenge society's understanding of war trauma. Many soldiers experienced what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time it was poorly understood and often ignored. Veterans described recurring nightmares, anxiety, depression, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Unlike previous generations of returning soldiers, many Vietnam veterans encountered public hostility rather than celebration. The war had divided American society so deeply that soldiers were sometimes blamed for the conflict itself. Over time, veterans organized support networks and advocacy groups. Their efforts played a crucial role in raising awareness about PTSD and improving mental health treatment for soldiers. The experiences of Vietnam veterans would ultimately reshape military support systems and influence how future conflicts addressed psychological trauma. The Vietnam War profoundly changed American politics. Public trust in government suffered lasting damage, especially after revelations such as the Pentagon Papers exposed internal doubts about the war's progress. Many Americans felt that leaders had misled the public for years, presenting optimistic reports while privately acknowledging setbacks. Congress responded by passing the War Powers Act in 1973, limiting the president's ability to deploy troops without congressional approval. The law reflected widespread concern about unchecked executive authority and aimed to prevent future prolonged military engagements without public oversight. The war also transformed media coverage of conflicts. Vietnam had been the first war extensively televised, bringing graphic images of combat and civilian suffering directly into American homes. These images shaped public opinion and demonstrated the power of media to influence political decisions. The Vietnam War also reshaped international relations. The conflict demonstrated that even a superpower could struggle against determined guerrilla resistance supported by local populations. Military strategists around the world studied the war's lessons, influencing future conflicts from Afghanistan to Iraq. The war also affected Cold War dynamics. Although North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union and China, tensions between those two communist powers complicated their involvement. Meanwhile, the United States began shifting toward détente, seeking improved relations with both Moscow and Beijing partly to prevent future proxy wars like Vietnam. For many countries in Southeast Asia, the war left lasting political instability. Neighboring nations such as Cambodia and Laos were drawn into the conflict, experiencing devastating civil wars and humanitarian crises that would continue for years after Vietnam's reunification. Beyond the immediate destruction of war, Vietnam faced severe environmental damage. The widespread use of defoliants such as Agent Orange destroyed forests, farmland, and ecosystems across vast regions. The chemical exposure caused long-term health problems for millions of Vietnamese civilians and American veterans, including birth defects and chronic illnesses that continue to affect families today. Efforts to clean contaminated land and provide medical treatment have continued for decades. The environmental legacy of the Vietnam War remains one of the most tragic and enduring consequences of the conflict, illustrating how modern warfare can leave scars that last far beyond the battlefield. In the years following reunification, Vietnam's leaders quickly realized that victory on the battlefield had not solved the country's economic crisis. The centrally planned socialist economy struggled to provide basic goods, and agricultural output failed to meet the needs of a rapidly growing population. State-run farms often lacked incentives for productivity, and industrial output remained inefficient. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Vietnam faced severe food shortages, rising poverty, and increasing public frustration. The situation became so dire that the Vietnamese government began quietly reconsidering its economic policies. Inspired in part by reforms in China under Deng Xiaoping, Vietnamese leaders debated whether limited market reforms could coexist with socialist governance. These debates culminated in 1986 with the introduction of the D-stroke letter 1ED5 IM letter 1EDB-I reforms, a sweeping transformation of Vietnam's economic system. D-stroke letter 1ED5 IM letter 1EDB-I, meaning renovation, introduced policies that allowed private enterprise, encouraged foreign investment, and decentralized agricultural production. Farmers were permitted to manage their own plots of land and sell surplus crops on the open market. Small businesses began emerging in urban centers, and foreign corporations cautiously entered the Vietnamese economy. The reforms did not immediately solve all of Vietnam's challenges. Inflation surged in the early years of economic transition, and inequality began to emerge between urban and rural populations. Yet over time, D-stroke letter 1ED5 IM letter 1EDB-I sparked remarkable growth. Vietnam transformed from one of the world's poorest countries into one of Southeast Asia's fastest-growing economies. Cities expanded, infrastructure improved, and millions of Vietnamese citizens experienced rising living standards. Despite these economic successes, the transition was not without controversy. Critics argued that market reforms weakened socialist ideals and created new social divisions. Nevertheless, the reforms demonstrated Vietnam's resilience and adaptability, showing how a war-torn nation could rebuild through pragmatic change. While Vietnam focused on rebuilding its economy, relations with the United States remained frozen for nearly 2 decades after the war. Diplomatic hostility, combined with economic sanctions, prevented trade and cooperation. The United States demanded accountability for prisoners of war and missing soldiers, while Vietnam sought international recognition and economic support. Gradually, attitudes began to shift. Both nations recognized that continued hostility served little purpose in a changing global landscape. The end of the Cold War reduced ideological tensions, creating opportunities for diplomatic dialogue. In 1995, the United States and Vietnam officially normalized diplomatic relations, marking a historic turning point. The normalization process involved years of negotiations and cooperation on humanitarian efforts. Joint teams searched for remains of missing soldiers, while Vietnamese officials worked to provide information about wartime casualties. These efforts helped build trust between former enemies and paved the way for economic partnerships. Trade agreements soon followed, bringing American businesses into Vietnam and opening Vietnamese markets to global commerce. Educational exchanges and cultural programs allowed citizens from both countries to connect, fostering understanding and reconciliation. Former soldiers from both sides even returned to Vietnam together, sharing experiences and honoring fallen comrades. The normalization of U.S. Vietnam relations became one of the most remarkable examples of post-war reconciliation in modern history. Two nations once locked in bitter conflict gradually transformed their relationship into one based on cooperation and mutual benefit. The Vietnam War's aftermath extended far beyond Vietnam itself. Neighboring Cambodia and Laos suffered catastrophic consequences that would reshape their histories. During the conflict, both countries became battlegrounds for proxy wars involving North Vietnamese forces, American bombings, and local insurgencies. In Cambodia, political instability escalated into one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. The rise of the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, resulted in a brutal regime responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 million people through forced labor, starvation, and mass executions. Vietnam eventually invaded Cambodia in 1978, overthrowing the Khmer Rouge government and triggering further regional conflict. Laos also faced devastating consequences. Heavy bombing campaigns left the country littered with unexploded ordnance, making Laos one of the most heavily bombed nations per capita in history. Even decades later, unexploded bombs continue to pose dangers to civilians and farmers. These regional crises highlighted the broader fallout of the Vietnam War, demonstrating how one conflict could destabilize entire nations. The humanitarian and political consequences would take generations to address, and the scars of war remain visible throughout Southeast Asia. As years passed, the Vietnam War began transforming from a current political issue into a historical and cultural memory. In the United States, the war inspired countless books, films, and documentaries exploring its moral complexity and emotional impact. Movies such as Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket portrayed the psychological and ethical struggles faced by soldiers, shaping public understanding of the conflict. In Vietnam, cultural memory developed differently. The government emphasized narratives of national liberation and resistance against foreign occupation. Museums, monuments, and educational programs honored Vietnamese soldiers and civilians who fought for reunification. Yet personal memories of suffering, loss, and displacement remained deeply personal for many Vietnamese families. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., became one of the most powerful symbols of remembrance in the United States. Its reflective black granite wall, engraved with the names of more than 58,000 fallen soldiers, allowed visitors to confront the human cost of the war in a deeply personal way. Veterans and families often left letters, photographs, and mementos at the memorial, creating an evolving tribute to those who served. Across Vietnam, war memorials and museums serve similar purposes, preserving memories while reminding younger generations of the sacrifices that shaped their nation's history. The cultural memory of the Vietnam War continues to evolve, influenced by new research, personal testimonies, and international dialogue. The Vietnam War fundamentally changed how military leaders around the world approached warfare. The conflict demonstrated the limitations of conventional military power against guerrilla tactics and insurgency movements. American forces possessed overwhelming technological superiority, yet struggled to defeat a decentralized and highly motivated enemy. Military strategists began re-examining counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence gathering, and the importance of winning civilian support during conflicts. The war highlighted how political legitimacy and public perception could be as crucial as battlefield victories. The lessons of Vietnam influenced future military operations, including conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Commanders increasingly emphasized cultural understanding, local alliances, and nation-building efforts. However, debates continue over whether these lessons have been fully understood or effectively applied. One of the most devastating legacies of the Vietnam War was the widespread use of chemical defoliants, particularly Agent Orange. The herbicide was used to destroy dense jungle vegetation that provided cover for enemy forces. While militarily effective in some areas, the chemical caused long-term environmental and health consequences. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were exposed to Agent Orange, leading to increased rates of cancer, birth defects, and chronic illnesses. Entire communities were affected, with families experiencing generational health challenges linked to chemical exposure. American veterans also suffered severe health problems after exposure. For years, many veterans struggled to receive recognition or compensation for their illnesses. Advocacy groups eventually pressured the U.S. government to acknowledge the connection between Agent Orange and certain medical conditions, leading to compensation programs for affected veterans. Efforts to clean contaminated land and support affected families continue today. The legacy of Agent Orange serves as a sobering reminder of how modern warfare can create lasting humanitarian and environmental crises. Women played critical roles during the Vietnam War, both in combat zones and on the home front. Vietnamese women served as soldiers, medics, intelligence agents, and logistical support workers. Many carried supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, treated wounded soldiers, and participated in guerrilla warfare. In the United States, women served as nurses, journalists, and anti-war activists. Female nurses working in military hospitals witnessed the devastating human cost of war, often forming deep emotional bonds with wounded soldiers. Many returned home struggling with their own psychological trauma, which went largely unrecognized at the time. After the war, Vietnamese women played essential roles in rebuilding communities, supporting families, and maintaining agricultural production. Their contributions to both wartime resistance and post-war recovery have become increasingly recognized in historical research and public memory. The Vietnam War's consequences extended into future generations. Millions of children in Vietnam grew up amid poverty, displacement, and environmental contamination. Some were born with health conditions linked to wartime chemical exposure, while others struggled with limited access to education and health care. In the United States, children of veterans often experience the emotional consequences of their parents' trauma. Families struggled with mental health challenges, financial instability, and social reintegration. The war's psychological legacy became a multi-generational issue, influencing discussions about veteran support and family counseling. Over time, educational programs and community organizations emerged to address these challenges. Both Vietnam and the United States began investing in programs aimed at healing wartime wounds and supporting affected families. One of the most remarkable developments in the decades following the war was the growing movement of reconciliation between former enemies. American veterans began returning to Vietnam, not as soldiers but as visitors, aid workers, and educators. Many sought closure by revisiting battlefields, meeting Vietnamese civilians, and participating in humanitarian projects. Vietnamese veterans also shared stories of survival and sacrifice, often discovering common ground with former adversaries. These personal interactions demonstrated the universal experiences of soldiers, regardless of nationality or ideology. Joint humanitarian efforts, including mine-clearing operations and medical assistance programs, became symbols of healing. These initiatives showed how former enemies could transform shared suffering into cooperation and mutual respect. Today, Vietnam stands as a rapidly developing nation, balancing socialist governance with a dynamic market economy. Major cities such as Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi have become economic hubs filled with modern infrastructure, bustling markets, and expanding industries. Tourism has flourished, attracting visitors eager to explore Vietnam's natural beauty and historical landmarks. Despite modernization, memories of the Vietnam War remain deeply embedded in national identity. Museums, memorials, and educational programs ensure that younger generations understand the sacrifices made by their ancestors. At the same time, Vietnam continues strengthening diplomatic and economic partnerships with former adversaries, demonstrating its transformation from a war-torn battlefield into an emerging global player. The Vietnam War remains one of the most complex and controversial conflicts in modern history. It challenged assumptions about military power, reshaped political systems, and left lasting humanitarian and environmental consequences. For Vietnam, the war was a struggle for independence and reunification, achieved at tremendous cost. For the United States, it was a conflict that forced painful reflection on foreign policy, military strategy, and national identity. The fallout and recovery from the Vietnam War continue to influence global politics and military planning. The conflict taught powerful lessons about the limits of force, the importance of cultural understanding, and the enduring impact of war on societies and individuals. Today, as former battlefields transform into thriving cities and peaceful landscapes, the memory of the Vietnam War serves as both a warning and a testament to human resilience. It reminds the world that while wars may end on paper, their consequences echo through generations, shaping history long after the final shots are fired. In the years following the fall of Saigon, the United States entered a period of profound self-doubt. The Vietnam War had not only failed to achieve its stated objectives, but it had also shaken America's confidence in its role as a global leader. Policymakers, military planners, and the public alike became deeply wary of foreign interventions. This reluctance became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a collective hesitation to commit American troops abroad without clear goals, public support, and a defined exit strategy. Presidents who followed Nixon struggled to balance Cold War responsibilities with the fear of repeating Vietnam's mistakes. Military action became politically dangerous. Any deployment risked triggering comparisons to Vietnam, and opponents were quick to invoke images of quagmires and body bags. The syndrome influenced American foreign policy throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, shaping decisions in places like Central America, the Middle East, and Africa. Military doctrine evolved in response. The U.S. Armed Forces shifted toward an all-volunteer military, ending the draft in 1973. This change fundamentally altered the relationship between American society and its military. Soldiers became professionals rather than conscripts, reducing public resistance to service, but also distancing civilians from the realities of war. Vietnam had taught the nation that wars fought without public consent could fracture democracy itself. Just as Vietnam began stabilizing internally, it faced another unexpected conflict. In 1979, tensions with China erupted into a brief but violent border war. China, angered by Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia and its alignment with the Soviet Union, launched a punitive attack along Vietnam's northern frontier. The war lasted only weeks, but it was intense and destructive. Thousands of soldiers were killed on both sides, and border towns were devastated. Although China withdrew its forces, the conflict further isolated Vietnam diplomatically and economically. The country now found itself facing hostility from both the West and a former communist ally. This isolation slowed Vietnam's recovery. Trade opportunities were limited, aid was scarce, and military spending remained high due to ongoing security concerns. The border conflict underscored a harsh reality for Vietnam. Victory over the United States had not guaranteed peace or stability. Survival now depended on navigating a complex and unforgiving international landscape. Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia to overthrow the Khmer Rouge created one of the most morally complex episodes of the post-war era. On one hand, the intervention ended a genocidal regime responsible for unimaginable suffering. On the other, it was viewed internationally as an act of aggression. Vietnamese forces remained in Cambodia for nearly a decade, fighting insurgent remnants of the Khmer Rouge and other factions. The occupation drained Vietnam's already strained economy and further damaged its international standing. Yet for many Cambodians, the Vietnamese presence was remembered not as an invasion, but as liberation from genocide. This episode revealed the blurred moral lines that often follow war. Vietnam, once portrayed globally as a victim of imperial aggression, now found itself cast as a regional occupier. The legacy of the Vietnam War had pushed the nation into new roles, no longer simply resisting foreign powers, but exercising power itself, with all the ethical complexity that entails. Decades after the fighting ended, the Vietnam War remains a battleground of memory. In the United States, debates persist over whether the war was a noble effort undermined by political failure, or a fundamentally flawed intervention from the beginning. Veterans, historians, politicians, and activists often tell vastly different versions of the same events. Some argue that the war could have been won with greater force or fewer restrictions. Others maintain that no amount of firepower could overcome the political and cultural realities on the ground. These debates are not merely academic. They influence how future wars are justified, fought, and remembered. In Vietnam, historical memory is more tightly controlled. Official narratives emphasize heroism, sacrifice, and national unity. However, beneath the surface, personal memories are far more complex. Families remember lost relatives, hunger, displacement, and fear. Many Vietnamese who fled the country carry memories of persecution and loss that clash with state-sanctioned histories. This tension between official history and lived experience illustrates how wars never truly end. They continue in memory, in education, and in identity, reshaped by each generation that revisits the past. Long after the last battles were fought, the Vietnam War continues to claim lives. Millions of unexploded bombs, shells, and landmines remain buried across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Farmers plowing fields, children playing, and families building homes still face deadly risks. Efforts to clear unexploded ordnance are slow and dangerous. Specialized teams work methodically to locate and defuse bombs, often in remote rural areas. Progress has been made, but experts estimate that it could take decades to fully remove the remnants of war. For many rural communities, unexploded ordnance limits economic development. Land cannot be safely farmed, infrastructure cannot be expanded, and fear remains a constant presence. The persistence of these hidden weapons serves as a grim reminder that modern wars leave behind dangers that outlive the soldiers who fought them. Vietnam transformed the relationship between war and journalism forever. Reporters had unprecedented access to the battlefield, broadcasting images of wounded soldiers, burning villages, and civilian casualties directly into living rooms. This unfiltered coverage challenged official narratives and eroded public trust in government statements. After Vietnam, military leaders became far more cautious about media access. Future conflicts would be tightly managed, with embedded journalists and controlled information flows. The lesson was clear: public opinion could be shaped, or shattered, by what people saw on their screens. Yet Vietnam also established journalism as a critical check on power. Investigative reporting exposed atrocities, questioned strategy, and forced accountability. The war demonstrated that transparency, while politically dangerous, was essential in democratic societies. The Vietnam War reshaped global culture. Music, art, and literature became vehicles for protest and reflection. Songs questioning authority, mourning lost lives, and condemning violence became anthems for a generation. Writers explored themes of alienation, trauma, and moral ambiguity. In the United States, the war accelerated broader social changes. It intersected with the civil rights movement, women's liberation, and generational rebellion. Trust in institutions declined, and skepticism toward authority became a defining feature of post-Vietnam culture. In Vietnam, art and literature often focused on endurance and sacrifice. Poems, songs, and novels commemorated fallen soldiers and celebrated survival. Over time, more nuanced works began exploring personal suffering and disillusionment, reflecting a society slowly opening space for introspection. Military academies, policymakers, and historians continue to study Vietnam, searching for lessons that might prevent future disasters. The war taught that technological superiority cannot compensate for weak political legitimacy. It showed that wars fought without public support are unsustainable. It revealed how nationalism and ideology can outlast bombs and armies. Yet history suggests that lessons are often learned, forgotten, and relearned. Each generation believes its conflicts will be different, its strategies smarter, its outcomes clearer. Vietnam stands as a warning, not because it was unique, but because its patterns repeat. The Vietnam War did not end in 1975. It continued in refugee camps, in veterans' nightmares, in poisoned soil, and in political debates that echo to this day. Its fallout reshaped nations, altered global power dynamics, and redefined how wars are fought and remembered. Vietnam's recovery stands as a testament to resilience. From devastation emerged a nation determined to rebuild, adapt, and move forward without forgetting its past. The United States, too, was forced to confront its limits. its ideals, and the cost of intervention. Together, the stories of fallout and recovery reveal a deeper truth. Wars do not simply destroy buildings and armies. They transform societies, identities, and futures. And long after the guns fall silent, history continues to demand answers.